Welcome to the AI Micro Skills Podcast, where I'm curating the best lessons on AI for marketers who want to leverage what's available now. Today, I'm talking to Kuba Grajcar, who is the content marketing manager at ZenPilot. Kuba, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dan. So nice to get the invite to this and really stoked to talk about AI with you today.
So to kind of set some context for the audience, tell me a little bit about how you got into content marketing specifically and what you're doing at ZenPilot.
Sure. So my background is primarily as a writer. The first things that I did that led me to this career, although I didn't know at the time, is I wanted to write novels. I took part in NaNoWriMo. For those who know, you know, but it's a novel writing challenge that takes a month to complete. I did that, I think, 5 times. I still got the books on my shelf. Gotta hide them before my son learns to read because they're really cringe. So then I got really interested in self-development. I joined this personal training startup. Well, it's training in soft skills, right? And there I got some coaching, got some mentoring. I started writing content for them. After that, my first big job was as a one-person content army at a software company called SDX Next, software development consulting company, I should say. There, I did everything: blogs, email, website copy, sales presentations, you name it, I wrote it. And kind of scaled from there. I was lucky that, you know, the investment in marketing at SDX was quite big. So I got my first person kind of reporting to me, even though that was my first real job. I got my first person within like 3 months. And within, I think it was 4 or 5 years, I scaled to 10 people.
Nice.
Yeah, I really learned a lot throughout that journey. Over time, as I was managing the team, project management became quite important, and I fell in love with ClickUp, the project management tool. I think a lot of people have heard about it by now. I mean, back then it was tiny. It was just the beginning of ClickUp. I think they were in like year 1 or year 2, because that was 2018, I believe. Anyway, I wrote to ClickUp asking them to make a case study out of us. Which they did. Along the way, I met ZenPilot, which is the #1 ClickUp consultancy right now, and actually the first company to become a certified ClickUp consultant. And we've been on top of that game ever since. And I say we because I ended up joining ZenPilot as and focusing on creating great content for them ever since. Definitely a smaller team there, and I'm getting to do more kind of more stuff directly, which also led me to leveraging AI a lot more, because when you're a 1-person, 2-person team, you can't get away not using these tools to make a bigger impact right now.
It's one of my predictions for the year on AI that big companies and small companies will be taking swings at AI, but it'll be the small scrappy teams that actually figure out how to best use it. Some big teams are going to make some big investments, so they're going to have some big flops or some disappointing results, I think.
Oh yeah.
Just because that's just what big companies do. They make big investments, they don't properly implement, and then they don't do small little tests to iterate and get their way there. So you have to tell me, like, how did you've been using AI to like make your team of 2 feel like a team of 20, but how did you get into touring, like using it specifically to get blog posts out of podcasts?
Right. So to clarify, right now I'm an individual contributor at ZenPilot, and I've got Jeff Cypher, our productivity professor, kind of working hand in hand with him. He's head of marketing right now. We've both been using AI, and both has been, you're talking podcasts into blogs. I'm doing a lot of that. I'm going to talk a lot about that. Jeff, what he's doing is he's also recording YouTube videos and creating blogs based on that. And I really love his prompts for that. So you should check that out on the ZenPilot YouTube and the ZenPilot blog. Within that realm, well, it's the kind of the problem that I was happy to have is that, as I was joining ZenPilot, there's this really active podcast, and a podcast with a long history called Agency Journey that Gray McKenzie has been hosting, and in previous seasons also the co-founder Andrew Dimsky was involved in hosting. So like a whole treasure trove of shows. Regular episodes were coming out as I was joining, and as I was getting up to speed at ZenPilot. So the problem I was faced with is, how do I take these really good conversations full of insights, with a really focused audience? I mean, I say really focused. Certainly you can get more focused, right? But Agency Journey, Gray has managed to get some of the biggest names in the agency space there, sharing their insights. How do I turn that into content that is easy enough to produce for a small team, but also makes for good reading, right? And it's very hard to strike that balance. I've experimented in a few ways with this. I don't think I am entirely done experimenting, but some of the things that I've worked were heavily based on using not just ChatGPT, but Claude. I realized as I was looking at previous episodes of your show that you often ask about ChatGPT first. So do let me know how much I can talk about Claude versus ChatGPT
Yeah, I
here.
never talk about Claude. Honestly, I'm just not interested in Claude at all.
Oh, why not? Why not?
You'll have to tell me why I should be, because I'm just not interested in it, because it just seems like they're behind. I'm probably sure they have some nuances that are better. And because ChatGPT's released custom GPTs and it's becoming multimodal, where I can use it to do images and code, and it formats everything well. I think I have an account with Claude. I tried it once and then just like, whatever, seems like ChatGPT to me. So I just stayed with ChatGPT.
Well, if you'll allow me, I'll try to make a case for Claude then.
There we go. Go for it.
Okay. So I would say, I mean, I've used both, and then my first impressions of Claude were that it gets you a lot further on the first prompt. Like I mentioned, I'm a writer by trade, so I have a strongly, what I would like to call a strongly developed taste when it comes to writing.
Yeah.
And the default ChatGPT voice, first of all, is people have got their radars really tuned to it right now. Like they can recognize it from a mile away if you don't do a lot of custom prompting to change that voice. And also it's really verbose, uses a lot of big words unnecessarily. I'm not a fan, right? And I know that you can go in the direction of kind of customizing it, tweaking it. Sure. With Claude though, my first impression was, wow, I can give it simple, short instructions. And at the time that was true, it can take a whole podcast transcript, which was really important for me, and it turns it into reasonably quality writing, like writing of a reasonable quality, I would say. The voice is more informal. It uses more direct, simple language. It knew how to kind of weave in quotes in there. I did have a bit of a tough time getting it to use quotes, kind of direct quotes from the transcript, but not at the time I was using YouTube transcript files, right? So there's no there's no punctuation to speak about, right? So it looked funny where there was like this perfect grammar and then the quotation marks start and it's this YouTube kind of unformatted raw text. But that's relatively easy to fix. Still, kind of everything around it, the structure of the blog post, the fact that it did spit out full blog posts of like 1,500 words at a time, that drew me to Claude initially.
Interesting.
I will say, yeah. Right now,
ChatGPT can only spit out, I don't know, it seems like it hovers around 700 to 800 words at a time.
Yeah.
So every time I've asked it to do a longer blog post, I found I'm like, okay, well, I just have to break the blog post down into chunks, into sections, and then ask it for that section at a time. And you're right, it does throw out words that are just like, dude, no one uses the word delve. And it's like fascinated with that word. Or in conclusion, you're like, oh my gosh, nobody writes like this. Stop.
Exactly. And Claude gets formulaic too, but it was not super grating, Like a person could get away, like it could just be a relatively inexperienced writer that falls into certain kind of patterns, right? It doesn't sound like a machine so much. So I know that, I want, as this discipline develops, you're going to want to get into custom GPTs, like, full on assistants, right? And you're not going to interface with the AI itself so much. But I will say, give Claude a shot if you haven't yet. Give it a full podcast transcript. It even gets as simple as write a blog post based on this, and see how much further it gets you to a reasonable blog post. And then with custom prompting, it gets even further in there. I gave it simple instructions like use storytelling, use a slightly informal style, write it from the perspective of the host, use a lot of direct quotes, and just, the prompt was kind of to the effect of what I just said. Plus Claude, it gave me good results. Plus ChatGPT, it needs more guidance than that. So yeah, I wanted to get into that because I am a big Claude fan and proponent right now.
Well, I mean, you're winning me over. I'm like, man, maybe that's why I've been writing short blog posts with ChatGPT, but it's like, they're just okay. They're okay.
Yeah.
But because I'm not a writer, I like multimedia. I like writing. I write a lot of LinkedIn posts, but I don't like writing long form content. So when I found out I could use AI to write the long form content for me and it was reasonably good, I was like, good enough. My taste in it were so, I don't know. I hated writing enough that I just was like, nah, it's good enough. C plus is good
Yeah.
enough for me. But if
Yeah.
Claude can get me to B plus, I'm like, well,
I know a
throw
lot of
over
people
there.
who, I know a lot of people who can write long form content well, but not a lot of people who enjoy it. Those two groups,
Yeah.
they don't always overlap.
Yeah. I think my greatest strength as a writer has more to do with me just being a better teacher than it actually is with writing. I'm not a great writer, but I know how to teach and I know how to break complex topics down into small chunks.
Yeah.
And that helps because obviously a lot of blog posts is education. And so since I can better educate, but obviously if you read some of my blog posts that I've written personally, like you will find many problems. Like a writer will be like, this is horrible content, but I'm like, yeah, but it ranks number one and it's really good at teaching people things. So
Exactly.
can't be a
Yeah, I
total
feel that.
loss.
Okay, so
Well,
where do we go from here?
I would like to know, what are you finding are the key benefits of turning your podcast into blog content? Because I remember even at Sweetfish, we were doing a lot of blogging for podcasts. People would publish it and then it would just go unnoticed. How are you using it to its full effect?
That's great. So I would say one of the benefits, of course, is you get a fair shot at SEO. And turning, like, it depends on the structure of your show, right? Some people have an SEO first approach where it's like the guest gets informed from the get-go that we'll be focusing on this topic, and the topic is well SEO research, and you basically want to hit the keyword, right? Other shows, and this is the case that I've got with Agency Journey here, is more of a pick your brain kind of thing, right? Within one episode of Agency Journey that's like 30 to 50 minutes, let's say, you might go into like 3 big topics, right? So then it's not easy to take that and turn and kind of match it to an SEO keyword, right? So one thing that you can so one benefit is that, on the one hand, yeah, you don't go so deep into one topic that might be matched to an SEO keyword, but for 3, you've got, some content that you can repurpose. So with AI, with the benefit of scale, previously it was not feasible to take one single podcast transcript and work on it so long that you turn it into 3 separate blog posts, each focusing on a different angle, on a different SEO keyword. Now that is becoming much more possible. So trying to stick to the question, one of the big benefits is that at least you give yourself that SEO shot, based on that podcast transcript. You don't have to stick to very brief show notes. You don't have to stick to very brief bullet points, but you can actually say, okay, take everything that person said on audience growth, right? Within that 50-minute podcast, there might have been a 15-minute segment. That's a lot of content. You take that, extract that, and turn that into a blog post. I wanted to highlight one tactic that I heard about but haven't tried myself yet is once you have 20 episodes and 4 of the guests, let's say, talk about audience growth, you might experiment with taking, kind of grouping it together, and then you've got quite a longer piece of content just on audience growth. And once you start that grouping process, I think that can take you much further. But I think you would have to re-interview me in like 6 months for me to report back on that kind of clustering strategy. So that's one. Second benefit is we're turning our podcast content into a lot of vertical short form content. So shorts, right? It's the age of vertical shorts. And it's just much more useful for us when we post something on, let's say, LinkedIn is even a good example. These are going out right now on my profile via Agorapulse, automated, really recommended.
Yep.
There's this first comment underneath, go here to watch the full episode. You could link to YouTube, you could link to Spotify, but in terms of conversion, you're kind of stopping it in its tracks, right?
Yep.
If you've got an associated blog post, then at least they land on your site, they can grab the cookie, and they've got all sorts of, further points of conversion from there. With ZenPilot, they can book a call, they can get a free download. We've got these banners in each piece of content that can kind of get them into our system and actually drive pipeline. And again, if you're a small team, you might be tempted to just say, okay, link to the YouTube video is good enough. And certainly that would have been true pre-AI. Right now, you don't really have an excuse not to have something to link to, some way of getting them on your site from that social media piece of content.
Yep. So those 2, chance at ranking on SEO, vertical short videos, and having something to link back to your blog post.
Yeah.
Is there anything else?
you do get a chance to kind of comment more on what was said during the show, right? So there's, I'm sure you must have experienced that as a host. You finish recording and you're like, I wish I said that. I wish, I alluded to these additional resources. Like if you go deep enough, if you spend enough time on it, you can say, the guest here, Kuba, mentions, this tool. And here, by the way, here's my guide on using that tool, right? So you can kind of expand on it
plug
in a
some
more
advertisements for your thing, right? Or at least you can cross-link other content, right, on a blog more easily than you can in a podcast. So I might be able to say like I'm going to do this, for example, but I usually don't do this. Like, I also talked about podcasting and AI in an episode with Susan Diaz just a few weeks ago. You should check out that episode. That'd be kind of awkward to plug mid podcast, right?
Yeah,
I mean, unless it's contextually relevant, but in a blog post, that's normal and fair game.
Yeah. And actually, one more comes to mind. If you are doing shorts, then I think like the way I envision the perfect blog post based on a podcast episode, and again, with AI, this becomes feasible even for smaller teams, is that it breaks the discussion into like logical sections, whether I'm going to summarize the whole podcast or I'm going to summarize this one particular thread in a podcast. Let's say whole podcast for now. You've got these clear sections. The text I personally would make heavily based on direct quotes. And when you prompt well enough, you can get direct quotes from the transcript and match them to certain topics.
Yeah.
And ChatGPT, I will say, has this over Claude. I've seen threads on X about this, X/Twitter. Do we say X or Twitter on this show? Let's go with X, right? So I've seen it that ChatGPT drops much less of the kind of the input with longer inputs right now. So they have really caught up and surpassed Claude in that respect. So the perfect blog post has these clear sections. The text is based on direct quotes, just to signal to the readers this is not AI. This is what they actually said on the show. And to drive the point home, if you've got shorts, just embed them. And I feel like this gives somebody like such a much more robust way to interact with the content of the episode, because I mean it's daunting. You see a podcast episode 43 minutes, you've got these chapters to kind of go on, right? But it's even better if you can scan not the whole transcript but a reasonable summary of it, and if something sounds interesting, boom, there's like a well edited 1 minute short that gives you just the absolute gist, the essential part of that of that part of the episode. I think that would be kind of the holy grail here.
Can you walk me through the typical process for turning a podcast episode into a blog post?
Sure. Okay. So I've picked up a few things here that have saved me a lot of time and in some cases money. So when I've got a fresh podcast episode, I work with a freelancer to get them edited. The first thing I do is I take the audio file and I plug it into a tool called Revoldiv. revoldiv.com. I don't know how they do it, and I don't think. Sorry?
It's Revoldiv?
Revoldiv with a D.
Revoldiv.
D-I-V are the last three letters.
What a name.
I'm glad that the name is kind of obscure and hard to remember, because I hope not a lot of people are going to use it. Right now, they just do free transcripts, okay? If you've got a podcast out there on Apple Podcasts, for example, episodes of your show are already transcribed there, and they do it for free. There's not even, as far as I can tell, there's not even ads on the site, although my ad blocker might be having something to say about that. That was a total gem when I found that. And of course, I found it on Reddit, because that's where all the best stuff. I am still using that, Revoldiv, yeah.
How are you not using something like Cast Magic already?
Revoldiv
have you heard
does
of Cast Magic?
I have, but what's the case for it then?
You upload you upload it. I think it sends it to Rev to transcribe it, and then it goes over it with ChatGPT to identify the speakers, separate them out, and clean up the transcript so that the transcript has better grammar. Because when people speak, like the sentences come out weird sometimes and need to be fixed. So it cleans the transcript so you have a really nice transcript, and then it gives you can build in all the prompts to it. So every time you upload it, it gives you like title ideas, summaries, questions, outlines, LinkedIn post, all that stuff. And then you can bake in whatever prompts you want, or just go right to the chat and it'll deliver based on the transcript, whatever you want.
Okay. So I think I might have been on the receiving end of Cast Magic as a guest. About Revoldiv, what I will say is, well, one advantage is that it is totally free. And second, it does most of the things that you mentioned on the transcript side. Identifying speakers, yes. Cleaning up the grammar, yes. It prompts you as you give it the file, as it's uploading actually, to identify, to give you the names of the speaker or kind of the names of the companies involved, so that if it's not sure, it's going to lean on what you gave it. So for example, my very popular name, Grajcar, right? It wouldn't pick it up ever. But if I give it that name in advance, then it'll recognize that if it sounds like it might be that, then it will.
Well, that's pretty good for free, because Cast Magic obviously costs some money, not a lot, but some. You're gonna have to give me the link to it. So I just searched for it and I couldn't find it, but I'll make sure to link to it in show notes for others, because the price of free for clean transcripts, I'm impressed. Yes. So I'm gonna have to link to this one for sure.
I was surprised too, and I'm sure they're not going to keep doing it forever. But for now, not just that you can give it your own file, but also if there's an existing show that you want to use a part of for any reason, then the transcript's already there, and that is huge. That you can take an existing show, which you might not always have a file of, right? I know there's ways to grab that, but okay, let's not get into that. So that's step one. Once I have that transcript, I plug that into and in this case I might use Claude, I might use ChatGPT. These days I've been using ChatGPT, experimenting more with GPT-4, because I still think it's the better thinker. I think Claude is the better writer, but GPT-4 is the better thinker. I am talking about GPT-4 on ChatGPT Plus. What I like to do, I go a little bit more under the hood. I spend a little bit more time on these. So I'm not looking for it to spit out like a whole blog to work with, but I do want to have the building blocks, or,
So what is it doing for you? What do you prompt it with?
So I prompted with, I'm trying to basically emulate my thinking. What am I looking for as I analyze a podcast episode? Tell me the main topics that the guest touched upon. Tell me about the subtopics within those topics. Kind of give me a tree of those, right? Within topic A, what are the 3 subtopics that they touched upon? What are the pieces of personal trivia that they shared about themselves that I'm going to use, for flavor, or as an attention grabber in the intro? What are some other questions that they may have been asked? Then I put it through the lens of the audience, right? So one of the things, I've got basically a list of 10 things to look for within the transcript. And one of those is from the perspective
you got that in front of you? Let's read it out.
In front of me. If you give me a second, I should have that. Pause. So most recently, this has been the main topics that the guest covered, the subtopics within these topics that the guest covered, any interesting questions, and here's where I plug the audience. From the perspective of an agency operator, we use that, a person focused on operations within an agency, could be an agency owner, or just insert your audience here, right? That the guest answered. List other questions that the guest was asked. Seems superfluous, but I just want to know that I've covered everything, and if there were other interesting questions in there, that I catch them. And some of it is pretty, kind of common sense, but I still want to catch it, is identify the most surprising, unusual, or interesting things that the guest mentioned. Like I said, personal flavor or trivia. And, typical show note stuff is identify any tools or resources or people to follow, or even, service providers that the guest recommended within the show. And one piece of tactical advice that has worked for me as well is I often use the phrase, I expect long output, and I give the amount of words that I want. So to make the analysis as deep as possible, I say I expect long output, 1,500 plus words. And I don't think it hits exactly that, but that just prompts it to go a lot longer. I've noticed that these tools, there are certain things that you can say to them, like write me a blog post, that make them go into this kind of long form mode where they recognize, okay, I'm going to give you the first part of a blog post. Do you want me to continue? I like that. That gives me a lot to work with, right? But it wasn't so easy for me to to get it into that mode. And saying I expect long output is something that has worked for me to get just a longer message out of it. In response.
To repeat these back, you had main topics, subtopics, I said put interesting questions, more like other questions asked.
Yeah, these are 2 separate
that
parts.
Weren't in your initial question list, because you already have those written down.
Yeah.
audience perspectives. Like, fill me in more on that. Like, what do you mean by audience perspectives? You're looking for the perspectives of the audience of like what about their perspective?
It's not super sophisticated right now in my workflow, but I just, I plug it in where relevant to say, what would an agency operator find interesting here? Or like, I can see that you listed, I don't know, 10 different things about what they mentioned within the domain of X. And, sometimes I ask it to rank these in order of importance for an agency owner and justify your thinking, and that gives me a lot to think about in terms of this. I would say this is particularly useful if you're kind of new to your domain as a marketer, and you're doing the audience research, right? But you're still getting immersed to get some additional input from ChatGPT about what is typically important for your audience. So you've got kind of a leg up in terms of picking the most important or most interesting parts of, in this case, a podcast transcript to work with.
I mean, you fleshing it out this way is interesting, because I've not done this before. So that's why I'm asking like the little nitty gritty details.
Sure.
I'm going to send you what I've written down, and then you fill it in with other things, because I think the audience would be interested to have this. If you want to find this, go to my blog post that I'll be writing using this method in order to prove this on AImicroskills.com.
Okay.
So, but this is really cool. And so what do you do next after you ask it these questions? You ask it, it provides it, you look through them. Now what?
Okay, so the output from that is not a blog post, right? But it gives me at least kind of insight into what was covered on the podcast episode. And by the way, kind of the particular scenario that I'm dealing with is that this is not a podcast that I personally host. So I'm taking, something that's been created by kind of, it was run by somebody else, which is why I'm also kind of digging into the questions that were asked, etc. So now I've got this kind of cornucopia of everything I could focus on in terms of the blog post draft. And at that point, and I don't have like a super specific prompt for this yet, but I do say, draft a blog post based on this and focus on, and I pick from the topics mentioned, subtopics mentioned. I just comment in natural language. This seems interesting. This seems relevant. Focus on these parts. Sometimes I might say that, these other parts are not super important. Like, for example, they promoted their product, right? And based on that, write the blog post. Things that I've had to do recently with GPT-4 is to re-emphasize that, because I've had it, and you might be hitting that too if you're doing it kind of soon, that it responds with, okay, but this podcast transcript is copyrighted material that I actually can't interact with in this way. Like, I'm refusing to write a blog post for you because they
put new guardrails on that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So I don't have a lockpick for that yet, but what has worked is re-emphasizing we own the rights. You can do this. Also, kind of going into that, I believe in you territory, which I have seen the research that that's saying stuff like I believe in you. You can do this. Actually improves results, as well as I will tip $200, which I haven't yet tried, but the research is out there that it helps. I'm reading all about it on X actually, but I'm going to mention that a little bit later. So, once you insist once or twice, it actually can be convinced to, I say stuff like, I work at ZenPilot, Gray McKenzie is my boss. And also because I've seen it work and I've read about it working, I do give it some kind of emotional incentive. Like, I will be in trouble at my job if you don't give me this blog post. Shouldn't work, but does. And there's many things in AI that work that way. So once it spits out that blog post, here's where I hit kind of the biggest snag thus far. And my recommendation right now would be generate 2 drafts, okay, following this process in separate chats if you want, because that sometimes helps to have kind of different content. And then my approach right now is to get to work on those drafts, treat them as raw material, put them together, select one section from one, another section from the other. Sometimes I'll go back to the chat.
So are you drafting this in OpenAI and Claude? You're like running this whole process twice?
I've done that sometimes. One thing that changed for me recently is that I no longer I used to have access to Claude in a kind of unlimited fashion. Okay, I had one of those kind of beta accounts. So, but anyway, that's one thing that you might do is to compare outputs from 2 different models, even within the same model. You can tweak the prompt somewhat, or just make it have another go at it, and it will be different enough. And I've found that once you get into like 3 drafts, 4 drafts, unless you give it like a very different angle to work on, like focus only on subtopic A and go, right? You're hitting diminishing returns right now, I would say. You're hitting diminishing returns, and it's time to just start working on this as a regular draft. You've mentioned on this podcast, you've got like a genius college student here, right? But to get it to a professional level, you need to have that senior editor come in and do some work on that draft, and it's really difficult to get ChatGPT to write something that is like, yeah, just put that into HubSpot CMS and publish. I don't think it's there yet, and I think once you're 80% happy with the draft, just polish up the rest of it yourself. And if you need to, just use it for specific things like suggest a meta description. Well, HubSpot does that kind of within the tool right now. Suggest some alternative titles, or kind of going back to the conceptual stage. What is an entirely different angle that we could take for this blog post? If we were to give it a certain style or focus on a different subtopic, then yes, ChatGPT can help brainstorm that, and it can help give you kind of the analysis, the building blocks. It's just not that great at kind of the actual writing yet, but it can give you a draft that kind of eliminates the blank page here. So in practice, what I do is I generate a draft or 2, edit that up, and then it goes into kind of the polishing and publishing stage of things. And feel free to dig into kind of more specifics here.
Yeah. Are you using AI to publish any of the content, or are you pretty much rewriting all of it?
I would say right now, the drafts that I'm putting out there are 60-70% AI generated. But that is because I've decided that right now the best play is to focus on quotes. So, the quotes are by definition, human content. There's just other words around those quotes that are AI generated, right? But that just gives me a lot less to focus on in terms of fact checking, etc. Because again, I think kind of the biggest gold on a podcast is what the guest actually said. They said it in conversational language by default, right? So just expose that, build some context and transitions around it, some smart headings, and that's how I would approach this content right now. So again, 60-70% AI generated, but of that, you might say, half is just focusing on direct quotes. And it reads like something that you would read, it's kind of journalistic a little bit, or it reads more like an interview summary, right? But I feel like, personally, I like that content because at least in the age of AI, I know that if something is in quotation marks, then that is something that a human actually said on that show, and that's something I can, more or less trust if I trust the person. Everything else outside of quotation marks, you can never be sure these days.
Yeah. How do you ensure the AI preserves the essence and tone of the original podcast?
I have something here. I guess, right now you would replace it with a custom GPT, right? But before custom GPTs, I was using Text Expander for this, Like, to keep things consistent, my main pain point was I was frustrated that, in this case, Claude, but ChatGPT has the same problem, that it didn't have context about ZenPilot. So if there was something there to be kind of emphasized or caught from the perspective of what ZenPilot does, it didn't catch that because it didn't know my company. And I was just frustrated kind of briefing it on what ZenPilot is over and over again. What I did simply is I started a Google Doc. As soon as it became possible to analyze websites with, I believe that was GPT-4 that first had that, I gave it the ZenPilot website and I said, just summarize everything from that website, and also added some of our internal stuff as well. Everything you know about ZenPilot into like these brief points. And I had it as a numbered list. So it came up with like 35 points, Who are the founders? What's the year it was established? What is the main target market? What are the main services? What are some kind of notable free downloadable resources? Just going deep into everything that's to be known. And the ninja move here, if I can call it, is to use Text Expander. So I saved that in Text Expander as our kind of prompt template. And whenever I went into either Claude or ChatGPT, as you can tell, I use these kind of interchangeably. I use the prompt template to begin with. ending it with, and that's important if you want to save time, respond only with, okay, ZenPilot template loaded, right? Otherwise, it's going to try to do something, whatever it thinks is best with that content. So, but I think that's something that a lot of people have already discovered, right? If you've got this template, then give it something to respond with every time. So it doesn't spend so much time kind of typing out an answer that you're not going to use anyway. So in terms of kind of keeping it true to kind of focus on what ZenPilot offers, and because we do content marketing to drive pipeline, of course, and to keep it consistent, then this prompt template really helps. And one thing that I definitely wanted to plug coming into this, if you're not using Text Expander yet, I discovered
I thought I understood what Text Expander is. Explain it to me.
Text Expander basically allows you to set up these shorthands for whatever you might want to type into an input field, basically. So, if
Within
you
a
don't
Mac?
I use it on Mac. Is there a Windows version? I can't say from memory. I would assume yes, but I first
Is this an app where you're putting in short codes and it's just essentially pulling in what you've trained it to pull out? Like you put in a code and then it pulls in something you've trained, like a whole couple sentences. Is that what it is?
Yes, but it can do more than just a couple sentences. So, when I used to experiment a lot with I asked Claude for a draft based on the same transcript like 5 times, or I noticed that it's sometimes better to start a fresh chat with the same transcript because otherwise it starts really leaning on the previous content and kind of repeating itself and going into more and more verbose language. It really saved me time to have the transcript itself saved as a text expander prompt, because there isn't much of a limit on how long these can be, kind of the output, right? So I define these as, I think my kind of template for these was like ZP trans Dan, let's say, or like Danchez, right? And then our conversation would pop out each time. Where it gets interesting, though, kind of outside of the realm of AI, but this actually might get connected in the future, is you can make these company wide. So you could say, for ZenPilot, let's say it's like ZP address, right? And every time it outputs the address, the official kind of operating address of the company. Well, that address recently changed. So if a change like that happens, if everybody's leaning on Text Expander, actually, you don't have to communicate it that much because they'll use the same code, but they'll get a different output this time around. And it's like, oh, it changed. But
so essentially, Text Expander is a shortcode tool that you can use to load in all kinds of content, especially if you're using the same prompts over and over again. Then Text Expander makes it into, instead of copying and pasting it from a doc where you've stored the prompt, you can use Text Expander to load it in faster.
Exactly.
Slightly made irrelevant by custom GPTs, where you could build a custom GPT with that prompt already baked in, ready to go to some degree. But if you're a heavy Text Expander user, you're probably using it for lots of ththings, prompts included. And not every prompt, even repeated prompt, deserves its own custom GPT.
Exactly. Yeah, and then for those cases, or if there's a particular way of giving feedback to ChatGPT that you often use, like think deeper about this, or break it down into steps, then you might have those saved as text expander snippets as well. Snippets is what they're called, and then that saves you time. It's a small tactic, but every minute counts here sometimes.
Yep. What advice would you give to somebody who's still kind of new to this and hasn't been engineering prompts as long as you have, to get started writing blog posts with podcast transcripts?
That's interesting, because there's a lot to delve into here. I would say take it step by step and try to break down the process in your own head as well. Like, what do you do? Like, if you were doing this manually, what would you do step by step? And then try out each of these steps. Try to accomplish each of these steps with AI, and you will find, like I have, and thousands of other people have, is that for some steps it does a great job. For some, it might even give you, it might even make do a better job than you would, especially if you're doing these at scale, right? Or it would do it much faster. For some other steps, and this is a big piece of advice that I would have given myself as well, kind of in the past, is for some of the steps in this process, you have to concede. You can do it better for now, at least for now, right? So kind of break it down. Turning a podcast into a blog post is a long process that has a lot of moving parts. Which of these parts are you giving to AI? And then Of course, you can grab some prompts from the web. You can use custom GPTs, but I encourage everybody, especially at this early stage in the AI journey, to look under the hood, to spend some time with ChatGPT itself, and to just see, what works. Try to pull some levers, try to experiment with various things. Now, some people listening to this might not be so creative, right? And they might not have come up with certain things by themselves. I certainly wouldn't have thought to use stuff like, it might cost me this job if you don't give me good output here, these kinds of prompts. So in terms of sources of inspiration, I have deliberately turned my X feed into like basically all AI all the time, followed all the accounts, and I recommend it in terms of platforms. I've seen the AI content on LinkedIn. It's pretty good. Yours is getting better and better, of course, Dan. But in terms of deep stuff that's stuff that's based on research, kind of real papers being cited, then X is really good actually for this. I mean, people on X are really excited about AI. There's whole movements, almost feels like different kind of belief systems around AI being being formed there. So I would recommend doing some searching there. I mean, a lot of it is, there's some stuff here that you kind of have to filter through. But anyway, it gives you, for the less creative people, it gives you a lot of prompts to experiment with. It gives you a lot of ideas to kind of threads to pull on. And over time, I think this is what's going to happen with most of us, is everybody's going to develop their own prompting style at least, or maybe custom GPTs down the line.
Yep. It's one of those things where you can't go read a book about it. There's courses about it, but the courses are kind of like over the top or too niche often. So really, I find just setting aside time to experiment is probably the best thing you can do by far. And this has kind of been true for like learning anything, right? Just setting aside an hour and be like, I'm going to try to play with this. I have this transcript from a podcast we did, and I'm just going to fiddle with it. And then I'm going to try it again. And then I'm going to try it again. I'm going to take some of this inspiration I heard from maybe this show or from a tweet thread somewhere, and I'm just going to try it out, form my own opinions, and then build my own. You just have to tinker. You have to set aside time to play. Otherwise, it won't work. It's not like code where it's more formulaic. It really is a really subtle and weird art of a black box where you're inserting stuff into this thing called AI and then pulling it back.
Yeah.
It's becoming more known what works and what doesn't work. Like silly things like try harder, telling it to try harder gets different results, and everyone's just trying to figure out how can I send different information in to get stuff back, and then how do I organize that information in such a way that works, right? Developers have been doing this for about a year now, and they're still new to it.
Yeah. Why does take a deep breath work? This thing, as far as we know, doesn't breathe, right? Yet, it's one of the best prompts. Also, like, I would recommend, if you're really just starting out with this, likely you have some existing blog posts based on podcast transcripts, stuff that took you, hours to produce. Here's one thing to try. Take that to ChatGPT as input. The input window is now much longer if you're on ChatGPT Plus, and even for GPT 3.5, you might be able to use chunks of it, and just ask it for a deep analysis of, okay, here's an existing blog post. Like, tell me everything you can surmise about it. Everything that you're noticing about it. Tell me about the style. Tell me about the structure. Kind of try to explain it. Kind of compress it into a description of the style, and use that for your prompt moving forward. It won't be perfect, right?
I do that all the time. You can actually download all your LinkedIn posts. So I did that recently. All the LinkedIn posts I've written over the last 3 years. Yeah, it'll give it to you. It gives you like a whole packet of files, and you have to go find all the one with the posts in it. I uploaded that as a CSV, and I was like, hey, analyze this document. And as an expert copywriter, analyze my style, my tone, and anything else that you think you would need to know to write better as me, and create a style guide for yourself that I can give you as instructions for the future. Bam. Create a custom GPT, take what it gives you, put that in the instructions, maybe even take your post and load that in the knowledge of the custom GPT, and you have your own personal writer.
This is the tip.
You could do that for company blog posts or company website. You could just be like, analyze the site as an expert copywriter, analyze the style, and write a style guide for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the thing to do.
I don't even know how to frame. I'm not a writer, so I don't even know how to frame my own tone. And a lot of people aren't. I mean, if you're writing blog posts for your company, you probably understand these things, but I'm like a multimedia marketer kind of writer, kind of not. So it was much faster for it to write it for me.
Yeah, I did that for my own writing, and even if I am a writer by trade, there's certain things that you're doing unconsciously, and it's interesting to see a deep analysis of your own writing style from somebody who has like infinite patience and something that has infinite patience. So like one thing that stood out to me is that it turns out I lean a lot on self-deprecating humor in my content, and I kind of, seeing that written, I was like, yeah, I do that. Although I would never kind of, if you were to ask me about my style up until recently, I would never say that this is one of my main, the main parts of my style. But yeah, it is. Now I know.
Yeah. So even if you're a writer, give it a shot. Have it build a writing guide for you. You can have it build a writing guide for anything where there's a consistent enough content, or even a few blog posts. It can go through and find a trend and then give you an analysis on that and then write more like
Exactly.
that.
Exactly. Yeah. I often, just as the last part of this, I often like to ask it about kind of the flavor, analyze the writing style, but also kind of be on the lookout, especially for the stuff that gives this person flavor, right? So, like one of our co-founders, Gray, that I mentioned already, his thing is baseball. He makes baseball references, so kind of catch that. For me, it's and I'm deliberate about it. I talk a lot about bass and doom metal music, kind of just for personal brands. This is going to help people stand out. So if you're analyzing something looking back, then you want to catch that. Then you can use that for analogies, and even AI content can become just much more engaging when you ask it to. And I've used that for podcast transcripts as well, kind of capture what the guest mentioned. And I think this particular guest was into jigsaw puzzles, kind of, and bake that back into, in this case, it was writing LinkedIn posts for her based on the podcast, which is a whole nother topic, but related, strongly related. And I looked at the LinkedIn post, the creator for her, and I was like, yeah, that's really good, because it's humanized, because I told it how to humanize the content more by focusing on these kind of hobbies and special interesting things about a person that gives them flavor.
Yeah, man, you've given me a lot to think about for this process, because it's something I'm doing like multiple times a week. I'm turning podcast transcripts into content. So taking your workflow, especially the questions you're asking ChatGPT about main topics, subtopics, interesting questions, what the audience would think about this, and getting all that data back is going to be very helpful for me. I can already tell. I'm like, I'm already going to build all these prompts into Cast Magic and just have it auto done, so I can read through it and better
Yeah.
analyze and understand the podcast itself, to then inform maybe not even more than just blog writing, though blog